Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Is there a method to Secretary of State Blinken's madness? What are we to make of his policies towards Russia, China, Ukraine, and Afghanistan? What comes first for him, values or interests? Is he informed by ideology or geopolitics? Does he believe in anything? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guests, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He is a historian, analyst, and author of the new book, Arise Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. And in Oxford, we have Mark Allman. He is the director of the Crisis Research Institute. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's go to Marcus Papadopoulos in London first. Marcus, what do you make of this Secretary of State? And we can throw in his colleague, Jake Sullivan. I mean, we've had a very turbulent last few weeks, particularly when it comes to the issue of Ukraine, but we had also the summit in Anchorage. So, you know, we have all of this dust being kicked up about Ukraine's sovereignty, which we can talk about it. Only one country has been compromising the sovereignty of Ukraine. That's the United States. You remember Victoria Nuland. And then we have Anchorage here. And then as we speak right now, the Biden administration is asking if Russia will join a climate change conference, and John Kerry, he's in China, if I'm not mistaken, and nobody really wants to talk to him. And the summit that was being proposed, the Russians are not interested in it. I mean, what's going on with Blinken and the others in the administration? They seem to have lost the plot. Nobody really cares what they think. Go ahead.
Well, Peter, I hold the premise that whilst it was the deployment of significant numbers of Ukrainian forces, including heavy artillery and missile systems, to the Donbass that precipitated the current crisis over Ukraine, I do not believe that decision was actually made by the Ukrainian authorities themselves. I believe that they were instructed to deploy its forces to the Donbass by Washington and London. After all, ever since the coup in Ukraine in February of 2014, the Ukrainian government has been nothing but a servile collaborator to both the Americans and the British. So I have to ask myself, Peter, the question, why have the Americans and also the British brought about this crisis over Ukraine? Is it because Washington and London, is it because the State Department, the National Security Advisor to Biden, are ignorant about the cultural and national security significance of Ukraine to Russia? Well, I believe that when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, yes, the State Department would have been, in many respects, ignorant about the significance of Ukraine to Russia. But I do not believe the State Department has been ignorant about Ukraine ever since the demise of the Soviet Union, and especially since the coup in Ukraine 7 years ago. So therefore, I have to conclude, Peter, that the Americans and the British instructed the lackeys in Kiev to deploy significant numbers of Ukrainian troops and Ukrainian military hardware to the Donbass to test the response of the Kremlin, to test the readiness of the Russian military. The Americans and the British will not relinquish Ukraine easily. They are absolutely adamant that Ukraine will enter NATO to encircle Russia on its western borders. It's a very dangerous policy the Americans and the British are playing here. But whilst I believe that the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor to Biden themselves are ignorant about Russian history, I don't believe that the people on the Russia desk in the State Department and also in the Foreign Office are ignorant about just how important Ukraine is to Russia.
Mark, we did see a bit of a stand down. I mean, the exercises were going into the Black Sea were kind of put on hold, maybe even canceled. Somebody's saying something here. But I mean, if we look at the media narrative, and it's really quite extraordinary that it's quote unquote reacting to Russian aggression as if you could be aggressive when you're moving troops within your own country. That's never properly explained. I don't understand it either because there's no logical answer towards it. But I mean, I think Marcus is on something here. I think it is testing resolve, and I think they got an answer. There's a lot of resolve here. The interesting thing for me is that the biggest loser in all of this is obviously Ukraine. But I guess the policymakers in Washington and London don't care about that. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I think this is the basic problem is that the Western states have not really understood that this is all vitally important to Russia. And even if you take the completely negative view of Russia's role since 2014, it still makes sense to think to yourself, what do we want out of this? Do we want to have a conflict with Russia? No, it would be suicidal and disastrous. But also we can see that if you try to have arm wrestling with somebody who you think it's a game and they think it's a matter of life and death, then you are going to soon find yourself in a real punch-up. And I think fortunately, perhaps, with regard, say, to the sending of warships to the Black Sea, the Americans have realized that they don't want to raise the stakes too high and then find themselves having to retreat or be pushed into a war. More problematic still, though, just coming back to your general points at the beginning of our discussion, is that for all the scorn poured upon Donald Trump as an amateur and unpredictable and so on in his foreign policy, it turns out that insofar as there's any continuity with Trump, it's where they carry on with his policies, but also carry on with being completely amateurish and unpredictable. And this is all the more bizarre because both Secretary of State Blinken and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, have been in high posts for years, including in the case of Blinken back into the 1990s. So we find ourselves, in a sense, facing a puzzle. These were supposed to be the people who would return professionalism and predictability and a well-ordered foreign policy. And certainly in the first 3 months, they behaved as though they are the kind of Trumpian rank outsiders and bizarre weirdos that we were taught to think of the disaster behind Trump's foreign policy. So,
keep going, please do.
No. So what then you have to say is if you are any other government, not just in Moscow or Beijing, but even if you're in Paris and Berlin, you have to ask yourself, what do we sign on to with these people for fear that you find that within a few weeks or a few hours even, the policy has changed, it's stood on its head.
Yeah, Mark is absolutely right here. I mean, how bizarre is it for you is that, you know, when there was the call between the Russian and the American president, we saw escalation on the NATO side and their surrogate, in this case, Ukraine. And after the phone call, we're told maybe there could be a summit here. I mean, why in the world would the Russians sit down for a summit after the antics that we have seen vis-a-vis Ukraine for weeks now? I mean, we have the Ukrainian president talking with French media. I mean, basically throwing down the gauntlet and basically also saying, you know, it's all or nothing. I mean, we're in NATO now, irrespective of the rules of entering the alliance, or it is a catastrophic war. I mean, what kind of surrogate is that? And what does it say exactly what Mark was saying, the kind of normalization of policy and stability here? I mean, it's a mockery of all of this. Is just one big mess that never should have happened in the first place. Marcus.
I'm of the opinion, Peter, that Biden's proposal during his telephone conversation with Putin to arrange a meeting in which the two leaders can discuss Ukraine was merely a propaganda exercise by the Americans. The Americans, and of course the British, have projected to their respective audiences and to the rest of the world that the current crisis over Ukraine was brought about by an amassing of Russian forces close to the border with Ukraine with the intent of invading Russia. And of course, the Americans, who are, as we all know, the guardians of peace in the world, the guardians of democracy, are trying to talk with President Putin to resolve it. Now, of course, that's nothing but a propaganda exercise. But I must also say this, Peter, I don't actually believe that Biden actually backed down, as some Western commentators are saying. No, I believe the Americans knew what the response of the Russians was going to be. London and Washington know very well that Russia is not going to back off when it comes to Ukraine. It is simply too personal for Russia, culturally and in terms of its national security. I would also corroborate my argument by saying this. Firstly, whilst the decision was taken to cancel the deployment of the 2 American warships to the Black Sea, the Americans are still going ahead in upgrading the Ukrainian ports of Odessa, Nikolaev, and Okhotsk to accommodate American warships. Secondly, it is now being reported in Britain that at some point this May, the Royal Navy will be deploying warships of its own to the Black Sea. So I don't think Biden backed down. I think it was a propaganda exercise. And as I said earlier in the program, they are testing the readiness of the Russian military.
You know, Mark, when the Americans and the British talk about protecting Ukraine's sovereignty, I think they have a very short memory, or they're just plain stupid, because before the February coup in 2014, let's remember this year, correct me if I'm wrong, but Lugansk and Donetsk and Crimea was part of Ukraine. After the coup, then the Crimeans, they voted with their feet, quite literally, and then the people of what we call the Donbass were the subject of a military assault, where up to 14,000 people were killed. So when they're talking about protecting Ukraine's sovereignty, I would think Victoria Nuland is probably the biggest egregious offender and violator of Ukraine's sovereignty. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, back in 2014, the West had this view that the Russians had, in a sense, swallowed a retreat to Moscow from 1989 onwards, and they would continue to do so. And as I'm using the kind of thinking that they would use. And also that passivity in Ukraine had been a big thing. And therefore you could have essentially a small-scale upheaval in Kiev, where a few thousand people overthrow the government, and everybody else would accept that. And it turned out that that wasn't the case. And it also turned out that the Russian state was not prepared to see Russian speakers perhaps being now subjected to people who were using the rhetoric of banning the Russian language, making all sorts of anti-Russian gestures. And I think the problem with the West has been that we have failed to think through not who might our rival or opponent be, but who our friends are. And in fact, in a situation of this sort, knowing who your friends are, knowing whether the people you're backing hold the same views, the same values that you think they do, whether they have the same policies and the same agenda that you want them to have, is a really important question to be able to answer. And it may be that people in our diplomatic services know the real answer to this, but our public opinion is very much shaped by the view that there's a plucky, democratic Ukraine faced by an autocratic Kremlin. And it fails to see that whatever problems are in Crimea and Donbass, there is an element we have to take into account, which is those Ukrainian nationalists and hard-right forces that actually see provoking trouble with Russia as a good thing because they want to draw the West in to do the fighting for them.
Mark, I want you to hold this thought here. We have to go to a hard break, and after that hard break, we'll continue our discussion on American foreign policy. Stay with our team.
When old truths seem wrong, when old rules just don't hold, and a new world is yet to shape out, disdain becomes the etiquette, and engagement equals betrayal. When so many find themselves worlds apart, we choose to look for common ground.
It's been decades since the fall of Spain's fascist regime, but old wounds still haven't healed.
Llevo 25 años intentando encontrar mis orígenes. Mi caso, mi familia adoptiva, me confirma que que por mí se pagó cerca de 1.000.000 de pesetas, 6.000 euros del año 65, es mucho dinero.
Thousands of newborn babies were torn from their mothers and given away in forced adoption.
Era una ley bárbara y bestial, fascista, pero no era un robo porque se hacía legalmente.
To this day, mothers still search for grown children, while adults look in hope for their birth parents.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. This is the home edition, and we're discussing American foreign policy. Okay, let's go back to Mark and Oxford here. We were going to the break. I'd like you to finish your point. Go right ahead.
I think there is the risk that the tail can wag the dog, and that those Ukrainians who essentially think the best way to preserve their own influence inside Ukraine and to assert themselves is through a conflict with Russia, which will drag in the West and make them, as it were, the heroes of conflict without them having to do the fighting. Now, this seems to be extremely foolish.
But isn't it? I mean, the thing is that I understand the geopolitical gambit, because essentially, no matter what the outcome politically, it's bad for Russia. Okay, if the Donbass is attacked by the Ukrainian forces, Russia will react. It's made it very clear this is a red line here. The Ukrainian military will be damaged severely, if not annihilated. Okay, but Russia will be, quote unquote, deemed the aggressor. Okay, so I mean, it's kind of, no matter what happens, if there's a military initiative, the outcome is a political defeat for Russia. But in that logic is a lot of Ukrainians are going to die as well here. See, and that's what I find really perplexing here. I mean, are they really willing to do that? Because Zelensky's standing, he will have lost the war. He will be out, okay? And then you have this virulent nationalist will probably take even a stronger position here. But Marcus, walk me through my scenario here. Does it make any sense to you? Go ahead.
The Americans and the British care nothing for Ukrainian sovereignty, like they care nothing for the welfare of the average Ukrainian man and woman. What they seek in Ukraine is to enclose Russia on its western borders. In a scenario where Ukraine is a member of NATO, then the Russian Federation on its western borders, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, will be encircled, and NATO eventually would become the dominant naval power in the Black Sea. Just take a map out and look at Ukraine's coastline. If Ukraine was in NATO, NATO warships from Odessa all the way to the Sea of Azov would be menacing not just the Russian Black Sea fleet, but Russian national security in general.
Okay,
NATO
Marcus,
airbase.
Let me jump in here just for a second here. Okay, we're talking about, and this is what's speculated about, Ukraine in NATO. Mark, what kind of Ukraine? I mean, Ukraine without the Donbass, Ukraine without Crimea. I mean, and then that is a violation of NATO's own rules, because a country cannot become a member if it has territorial disputes with its neighbors here. Now, NATO probably could break its own rules and rewrite them. I don't put that past them. But if there is a military conflict, it's just not going to be the Donbass. I mean, maybe it's all the way to Kharkov, okay? I mean, because if you look at it from the Russian side, I mean, if this is how you want to play, then we're going to look after our security interests. I mean, let's look at what happened in Georgia in 2008. I mean, South Ossetia was liberated. Then Russian forces went all the way down to Gori, not to occupy it, not to keep it, but to knock out all of the sensitive NSA equipment that was there. It was estimated worth to be $1 billion. NSA had a real headache with that one there. I mean, history does repeat itself at times, and I see this here too. So, I mean, what kind of rump state are we talking about when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, the tragedy of Ukraine is that, in fact, not just since 2014, but since 1991, life has been getting worse. Life expectancy has been falling, and so on. It's still falling. And so that's a big problem. If only Ukraine could have reordered its internal system, for instance, maybe people in the Donbass might have begun to think, do we necessarily want to be independent? But it's failed. The more dangerous thing, by the way, also talking about a conflict, is that, of course, both Western military equipment and Western trainers are in situ in Western Ukraine. But the problem is that those bases with anti-tank missiles and other weaponry would almost certainly be the targets in a war between Russia and Ukraine. So the fact that we have NATO personnel far from Donbass and far from the demarcation line with Crimea doesn't alter the fact that there are actually significant numbers of NATO military trainers and so on and military equipment in Ukraine that would be almost certainly collateral damage. And that may be a thought that would deter Russia from responding. But I think since 2008, for instance, over Georgia and South Ossetia, the idea that Russia would always be passive, that it would always avoid a conflict at any price, has turned out to be mistaken. And so even if you take, as I say, the most sort of negative view of the machinations of the Kremlin, you have to also ask yourself, what is the Kremlin's basic interest? It is to preserve Russia's sovereignty and to make clear that it isn't a puppy that's going to lie down and roll over. And therefore you have to be very careful about provoking it. And as I say, particularly once you have a conflict going, the risk of escalation is there. And the simple reality is that for Russia, it's a life and death issue, perhaps also for the Ukrainian government, but it's not a life and death issue for Western Europeans, let alone North Americans. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a situation that we might find ourselves provoking a major conflict and then wanting to back out of it. But that is not always easy to do. Once you start a fight, you can't then lay down the ground rules.
That's right. That's why we call it the fog of war. Marcus, I mean, looking at Secretary of State Blinken and Sullivan here, are they ideologues in your mind? Are they opportunists? Do they think in geopolitical terms? Because, Sullivan said he wanted to have a foreign policy for the middle class, which if they wanted a foreign policy middle class, they would end all these wars and stop killing young men and women and wasting all the money and maybe put a little money into infrastructure. I mean, what do you make of these people? Because personally, I'll just say it straight out, I think these people are low-octane thinkers. Go ahead, Marcus.
I agree with your analysis of them, Peter, and I also do not consider them at all to be intellectuals. I've been saying this for a number of years now, that the caliber of politicians in America and in Britain cannot be compared with the caliber in both countries from, say, 30 or 40 years ago. And in regard to the current Secretary of State and in regard to the current National Security Advisor, are they ideologues? Well, maybe in the sense that they believe in American global supremacy, that they believe in American exceptionalism, that they believe that the world is divided between good and bad, and that the good is the West and the bad is the East, principally Russia. And I think on that basis, they will pursue their policy, which they inherited from the Trump administration. I say the Trump administration, I don't say Trump, which the Trump administration inherited from the Obama administration, which the Obama administration inherited from the Bush administration, and so on. But I quickly want to say, Peter, that in regard to Ukrainian membership of NATO, you're right. NATO could bend its own rules to accommodate Ukraine into the military bloc. But I think it's far more likely that the Ukrainian government could sit down with its masters in Washington and London and decide that it's time to redraw the national borders. We're not going to, but they know they will not get Ukraine back. They know they will not retrieve the third of Donetsk and the third of Lugansk, which is gone. If they are to redraw their national borders, then yes, theoretically, the road is open to them joining NATO. And I also want to say, there is no tension between Ukraine and Russia. There is tension between the Ukrainian authorities and the Russian government. The only area of Ukraine you will find really in abundance runs anti-Russian sentiments is in Galicia, is in Ivano-Frankivsk, is in Ternopil. It's not just on the left bank of the Danube where you find a very pro-Russian or very pro-Soviet feeling. It's also on the right bank of the River Danube. If you go to Odessa, the people there, largely speaking, will say Odessa is a Russian port, which is historically accurate. So there is no tension between the Ukrainian people by and large, and the Russian people. There is only tension between the Ukrainian authorities and the Russian authorities. The Ukrainian authorities are lackeys. They are willing to see the destruction of their own country, which is an artificial one, for the sake of the monetary rewards they are receiving from Washington and London.
You know, Mark, one of the things, again, I find really perplexing is that if there is a conflict and it is resolved in the way that Marcus has just suggested here, it doesn't mean tensions will go away. Why would anyone want to invest money in Ukraine when there are tensions still with one of its neighbors here? And of course, Russia is going to make it very, very difficult for NATO membership here. I mean, it seems to me it doesn't solve any of Ukraine's problems whatsoever. And I don't see the European Union particularly interested in bringing Ukraine on board, okay, because of governance issue. It's a lot of agriculture. I mean, that really doesn't serve up any purpose for the EU when it has its own structural problems right now. I mean, I'm just kind of mystified. I guess it's kind of like the Saakashvili, phenomenon, that he believes all these really wonderful stories and the little trinkets that they put in front of him, but it didn't solve any of Georgia's problems either. I just, again, that's why I asked, are these people ideologues? Are they opportunists? How would you describe them? Go ahead.
Well, the basic problem for the political elite in Kiev is that because it hasn't managed to revive the economy at all, it is therefore dependent heavily on Western inputs, and by the way, also on fees for gas transit, which is why it's so hostile to the Nord Ost pipeline. And so you have a situation that the well-being of the citizens, which would involve serious reforms and improvement in the quality of life, improvement in the quality of government, but getting rid of corruption and so on, getting rid of the siphoning of money out into foreign bank accounts.
Getting rid of oligarchs.
Yeah, all of that has been put on the back burner. And as you say, this is not just for Ukraine, it's true to a great extent even of Georgia and, say, Serbia and other countries that seem to aspire to join the EU. The EU now says, well, wait a minute. Do we really want to take on the burden of paying for these countries to reach our standards, whatever those are? Particularly when you have this irony that the British are pushing these countries to join the EU and pushing for the EU to pay up, but the British have withdrawn from the EU and won't be paying into the budget. So in fact, the resources available to the EU for what we might call the peaceful economic integration of these countries are much diminished, and not least now with the COVID crisis and economic downturns. So we have this basic problem which besets the Western leadership, which is the inability to draw together the straws of military policy, foreign policy, economic policy, what is in our interests, what are our ideology and, as it were, principled aspirations. And so we see this shifting and turning, waving in the wind almost, sometimes being very assertive and aggressive in our vocabulary, then backing off. Just take Blinken's visit to Afghanistan. What would you say if you have the American Secretary of State coming to say, I reassure you, we're not abandoning you, but we're leaving? It's almost on the level of a Saturday night satire, isn't it?
All right, gentlemen, that's all the time we have. I want to thank my guests in London and in Oxford, and I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.